My new apartment didn't have a fourth floor. The moving boxes were stacked 3 high along the narrow concrete hallway of the Oak Ridge complex. It was a brutal, gray Tuesday afternoon in late November. The air outside was heavy with the scent of upcoming snow, but inside the building, the air felt entirely different. It was warm, uncomfortably warm, and thick with a flat, stagnant odor that reminded me of a public library basement after a heavy rain. My name is Arthur. I had spent the last 3 hours carrying my entire life up a winding, windowless stairwell to the 4th floor. The rent was impossibly low for this city. $500 a month for a spacious studio apartment with utilities included. The landlord, an old man named Mr. Vance who wore a faded beige cardigan, had only asked for a cash deposit. He didn't run a credit check. He didn't ask for references. He just handed me a heavy brass key and told me to keep the door locked at night. I didn't question my good luck. When you're scraping by on freelance technical writing contracts, you don't look a cheap apartment in the mouth. I unlocked the door to room 412 and pushed it open with my shoulder. The interior was empty, save for a single, yellowed mattress leaning against the far wall. The floor was covered in a uniform, short pile carpet. The color was a sickening, faded shade of yellowish beige, like a page from an old book that had been soaked in weak tea and left to dry in the sun. I dragged my first box into the center of the room and sat down on it. The silence of the apartment was immediate, but it wasn't absolute. Beneath the quiet, there was a sound, a low, continuous, mechanical vibration that seemed to emanate directly from the walls. I assumed it was the main building HVAC system or an old industrial boiler running in the basement. It had a strange, rhythmic drone to it, a steady, 60 hertz hum that caught in the back of my throat like a physical pressure. I took a deep breath and pulled my phone out of my pocket to check the time. It was exactly 3:14 in the afternoon. I decided to unpack my kitchen supplies first. I carried a box of plates over to the small kitchenette counter. The counters were made of a cheap, faux marble laminate that felt unnaturally cold to the touch. As I reached down to open the lower cabinet door, I noticed something unusual about the layout of the space. The apartment was supposed to be a perfect rectangle according to the black and white photocopy of the floor plan Mr. Vance had given me. But looking at the corner where the kitchen counter met the bathroom wall, the angle wasn't a true 90 degrees. The wall seemed to lean away from me at a subtle, distorting slant. It was barely perceptible, perhaps a fraction of an inch off, but it made the entire room feel slightly off balance, like looking through a camera lens with a very mild wide-angle distortion. I shook my head and rubbed my eyes. I told myself it was just fatigue from the stairs. Old buildings settle over time. Foundations shift, walls warp. It was a completely normal piece of structural degradation. I opened the cabinet door. The interior of the cabinet was entirely dark, and the damp, musty smell of the carpet was much stronger inside the wooden frame. I reached out with my hand to feel for a shelf, but my fingers didn't meet wood. They met a soft, porous surface. I clicked on my phone flashlight and aimed the beam into the cabinet. The back panel of the cabinet was missing. It had been replaced by a rough sheet of unpainted drywall. Someone had crudely cut a hole through the sheet, revealing a narrow, empty cavity between the apartment walls. I peered through the opening. The space inside wasn't filled with copper pipes or electrical conduits. It was just an empty, vertical shaft of darkness that stretched upward into the ceiling grid. I could hear the 60 hertz hum vibrating with an intense, metallic resonance inside that hidden void. It sounded like an old fluorescent light ballast trying to spark to life. My phone buzzed against my palm. The sudden vibration made me flinch. It was a text message from my friend Sam. He had promised to drive over after his shift at the warehouse to help me move my heavy oak desk. The text was short and natural. "Hey Arthur, just pulled into the parking lot. This place looks like an old hospital. What room are you in again?" I typed back quickly, my thumbs hitting the glass with a sharp clicking sound. "Room 412. Take the elevator in the lobby or use the central stairwell if the lift is broken. The hallway layout is a bit weird." Sam replied a minute later, "Got it, coming up now. Left the pizza in the car so it stays warm." I laid the phone down on the laminate counter and went back to the boxes. I carried a stack of books over to the built-in shelving unit next to the front door. As I walked across the room, I noticed a strange sensation beneath my sneakers. The carpet felt wet, not soaked, but noticeably damp, as if a pipe had leaked beneath the floorboards a few days prior. I knelt down and pressed my bare palm against the yellowish-beige fabric. It was cold and spongy when I pulled my hand away. It carried a faint, chemical odor. It didn't smell like regular water. It smelled like industrial adhesive or a stale detergent that had never been properly rinsed out of the fibers. I stood up and wiped my hand on my jeans. I made a mental note to text Mr. Vance about the floor in the morning. I didn't want to deal with a mold outbreak during my first week in the building. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Sam hadn't knocked on the door yet. The walk from the parking lot to the 4th floor shouldn't have taken more than 3 or 4 minutes at most. I walked over to the front door and opened it, stepping out into the empty, concrete corridor. The hallway was completely silent, except for that same, persistent electrical hum. The yellowed fluorescent fixtures in the ceiling grid were flickering with a rapid, strobe-like cadence that made my eyes ache. I looked down the long passage toward the elevator bank. The doors were closed. The digital floor indicator above the frame was blank. I walked down the hall toward the stairwell door. As I passed the neighboring apartments, I noticed that the door numbers didn't follow a logical sequence. Room 410 was followed by room 411, but the next door wasn't mine. It was labeled room 415. The sequence skipped 412 entirely on the exterior wall. I paused. I turned around and looked back at my own open door. From the outside, the brass numbers on my door clearly read 412, but the door directly across from me was labeled room 833. I stopped walking. I felt a sudden, sharp spike of vertigo in the center of my chest. I looked down at the concrete floor beneath my feet. The rough concrete had vanished. Sometime during my short walk down the corridor, the floor had transitioned smoothly into the exact same yellowish-beige damp carpet that covered the interior of my apartment. I hadn't noticed the transition. I hadn't felt the change in texture under my shoes. I looked up at the walls. The gray concrete blocks of the apartment hallway were gone. The walls were now covered in a uniform, mono-yellow wallpaper with a faded, repeating pattern of overlapping curves. The lighting had changed too. The flickering fluorescent fixtures were no longer recessed into a concrete ceiling. They were set into a grid of cheap, white acoustic tiles that stretched out over my head in every direction. I pulled my phone out with a shaking hand. I needed to call Sam. I needed to tell him to meet me outside in the parking lot. The screen lit up, but the signal indicator in the top right corner was completely empty. It showed no bars, no network name, just a small, gray icon of a cross through a signal tower. A fresh text message from Sam appeared at the bottom of the screen. The timestamp on the text read 3:33 p.m. "Arthur, where the hell is the 4th floor? I took the stairs up 4 flights, but the door led out into another hallway. All the doors are blank. There are no numbers on anything. Where are you, man?" I tried to type a reply, but my fingers wouldn't coordinate properly. I typed, "I am in the hall, come back down to the lobby. Something is wrong with the building." I hit the send button. A small, red exclamation point appeared next to the text box. The system message below it read, "Delivery failed. Network socket unavailable." I stood perfectly still in the center of the yellow corridor. I forced myself to close my eyes. I took 3 deep, deliberate breaths through my nose. The air tasted dry, intensely dry, like the air inside an old electronics warehouse or a server room that had been sealed for a decade. I told myself that I was having a panic attack. The stress of the move, the lack of proper sleep over the past week, the financial anxiety. It had finally culminated in a severe, localized episode of psychological dissociation. I was still inside the Oak Ridge complex. I had just taken a wrong turn into an unfinished storage section or a maintenance wing that Mr. Vance hadn't mentioned. The yellow wallpaper was probably just an old primer layer that had never been covered with modern paint. I opened my eyes. The hallway looked exactly the same. The light fixtures hummed with a maddening, high-pitched frequency that seemed to vibrate the very bones of my skull. It was a physical sound, a heavy, pressurized noise that left no room for any other thought. I turned around and walked back toward my apartment door. I kept my eyes fixed on the damp, yellowish-beige carpet, counting my steps to maintain a sense of reality. 1, 2, 3, 4. By the time I reached 30, I realized that my apartment door was no longer there. The corridor didn't end in a concrete stairwell or an elevator bank. It simply opened up into a massive, sprawling junction where 4 identical yellow hallways intersected. Every single wall was covered in the same faded yellow pattern. Every single ceiling tile was identical. There were no doors here, no windows, no furniture, just the endless, mono-yellow perspective stretching out into the dim, fluorescent fog. I stopped counting. I sat down against the yellow wall, my back pressed hard against the rough texture of the paper. The hum was louder now. It felt like it was coming from inside my own head, a rhythmic, looping circuit of electrical noise that filled my ears until they began to ring. I pulled my knees up to my chest and buried my face in my hands. I must have stayed like that for 10 minutes, or maybe it was an hour. Time felt elastic in this place, without the movement of the sun or the shifting shadows of the outdoor trees. There was no way to measure the passage of seconds. The world had become entirely static, a permanent, frozen moment of stale air and yellow light. A sudden sound broke through the electrical drone. It was a distant, hollow thud, like a heavy wooden door slamming shut miles away through an endless sequence of empty rooms. A second later, I heard a sharp, metallic scrape. It was the sound of something heavy being dragged slowly across a rough surface. The sound was irregular. It would slide for a few inches, stop for a moment, and then slide again. Skirt and click, skirt, click. Scrambled to my feet, my heart hammering against my ribs with a frantic, terrifying speed. I pressed my back against the wall, my eyes wide as I stared down the dark length of the northern corridor. The sound was coming from that direction. It was moving closer. It wasn't the sound of Sam's heavy work boots. It didn't have the bipedal rhythm of a human walk. It was a multi-limbed, fragmented movement, like a cluster of dry branches being dragged through a narrow space by an invisible cord. I didn't wait to see what was generating the noise. The primal, animal part of my brain took over, erasing every shred of logical thought. I turned to my left and began to run down the eastern hallway. My sneakers made a wet, squelching sound against the damp carpet with every step. The air rushed past my face, hot and smelling of old dust and burnt copper wires. I ran through 3 consecutive junctions. Every turn I took revealed the exact same landscape. Yellow walls, white ceiling tiles, humming lights. It was a geometric nightmare, a perfect, infinite maze designed by a madman. I felt a terrifying sense of certainty that if I looked down at my phone again, the clock would still read 3:14. The universe had narrowed down to this single, endless floor plate. I finally collapsed around a sharp corner, my lungs burning, my throat raw from the dry air. I fell onto my hands and knees, gasping for breath, my sweat dripping onto the yellowish-beige fibers of the floor. As I looked down at the spot where my sweat had fallen, I noticed a fresh clue. The carpet wasn't just damp here. A dark, oily fluid was slowly seeping upward through the weave of the fabric. It formed a distinct, black pool about 3 inches wide. I lowered my head to look closer. The fluid was perfectly non-reflective. It didn't catch the glare of the fluorescent lights above. It looked like a hole in the floor, a patch of pure, absolute void that had been sliced out of the world. I reached out with a trembling finger to touch the edge of the fluid. Before my skin could make contact, the black pool shifted. It didn't behave like water. It rose upward in a small, fluid spire, like a drop of ferrofluid reacting to a powerful magnetic field. It stretched toward my finger, a thin, black filament of matter that seemed to vibrate with the exact same 60 Hz frequency as the ceiling lights. I pulled my hand back with a sharp gasp. The filament snapped back down into the pool, dissolving instantly into the damp fibers of the carpet. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking so much I could barely maintain my balance. The paranoia was no longer a psychological symptom, it was a physical weight. I felt like every square inch of this environment was actively watching me. The repeating pattern on the yellow wallpaper looked like clusters of small, open eyes that shifted every time I turned my head. The hum of the lights wasn't a random mechanical failure. It was a voice, a massive, multi-layered choir of electrical currents that was singing a single, monotonous word into the empty space. My phone vibrated in my pocket again. The sound was muffled by the denim fabric, but it felt like an electric shock against my leg. I pulled it out with a jerk. The screen was completely glitched. The user interface had dissolved into a chaotic green salad of corrupted text blocks and scrolling lines of hex code. But in the center of the display, a single, clear text message window had broken through the corruption. The sender was listed as unknown. The message was a long string of lowercase letters, typed without spaces or punctuation. "You are an alongarinth the building Garther Thebeldingus inside you, please. Donnet move arms the partition ser closing." I stared at the words until they blurred together. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to laugh. I wanted to scream until my vocal cords split. I paused. I raised my hands and held them out in front of my face. I stared at my fingers. They looked real. I could see the small ridges of my fingerprints. I could see the pale crescent shapes at the base of my fingernails. I could feel the cold air moving over my skin. But if I was real, why did the world feel so thin? Why did the yellow walls look like they were made of nothing but light and old paper? I turned around and aimed my flashlight beam down the hallway behind me. The sound of the dragging limbs had stopped. The corridor was perfectly empty. The silence returned, heavier and more oppressive than before. I began to walk again. I didn't run this time. Running only exhausted my lungs and brought me back to the same yellow junctions. I moved with a slow, mechanical, deliberate pace, keeping my left shoulder close to the yellow wallpaper. I had read once that you could escape any maze by simply keeping one hand on the wall and following it continuously. I hoped to God that the rule applied to geometric anomalies. As I walked, the physical details of the environment began to degrade. The clean, white acoustic ceiling tiles were missing in certain sections, revealing a dark, cavernous void above the grid. I could see thick bundles of black cables hanging down from the darkness like the roots of a dead tree. They weren't connected to anything. They just hung in the air, their exposed copper tips dripping small, silent drops of that same black, non-reflective fluid onto the damp carpet below. The yellow wallpaper was peeling away from the drywall in large, wet sheets beneath the paper. The walls weren't made of gray concrete or wooden studs. They were made of a smooth, pale, yellowish matter that looked like human skin. It had a faint, oily sheen to it, and when the light from the ceiling fixtures hit the surface, I could see the subtle, rhythmic pulse of a massive artery moving deep beneath the wall layer. The hum changed pitch. It dropped from a 60 Hz vibration to a low, rumbling roar that shook the floorboards beneath my feet. I stopped walking. I couldn't go forward. The hallway ahead of me had completely collapsed. The floor had tilted downward at a terrifying 45-degree angle, sliding into a massive, open pit of yellow wallpaper and exposed ceiling grids that stretched down into an infinite, lit abyss. Millions of identical yellow rooms were stacked edge to edge down there. a vertical honeycomb of fluorescent lights and beige carpet that had no bottom. I backed away from the edge, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I turned around to go back the way I came, but the hallway behind me had changed too. Standing in the center of the narrow corridor, less than 20 feet away from me, was the entity. It didn't look like a monster from a movie. It didn't have a face or eyes or a distinct body shape. It was a massive, erratic tangle of black, biological filaments and industrial wiring that had fused together into a shifting, towering silhouette. It looked like a drawing made by a child who had pressed a black crayon into the paper until the tip broke. It was taller than the ceiling grid. Its upper section smashed into the acoustic tiles, tearing them away in showers of white dust. Its limbs were thin, sharp like needles, and they moved with a rapid, insect-like twitching cadence. Sometime during its pursuit, it had gathered sections of the yellow wallpaper and wrapped them around its central mass, creating a bizarre, yellow shroud that pulsed with the movement of the black wires beneath. In the center of the wire mass, where a head should have been, there was a single, small object. It was a brass room number plate. The numbers were clearly visible under the flickering fluorescent glare. 412. The entity stood perfectly still for 3 seconds. Then, it opened its mass. A wet, splintering sound echoed through the hall as a long, mechanical limb made of rusted iron pipe and black tendons stretched out toward my face. From the depths of the shifting wire bundle, a voice spoke. It wasn't a monstrous roar. It was a voice I recognized instantly. It was Sam's voice, but the cadence was entirely wrong. The words were chopped up, rearranged, and played back with a metallic, electronic distortion, like an old tape recording that had been stretched by a faulty deck. Arthur, I left the pizza in the car, the 4th floor, is function 314. Please do not alter the partitions. The paranoia inside my brain snapped. The psychological wall I had built to maintain my sanity completely crumbled. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I simply dropped my flashlight onto the damp carpet. It rolled a few inches, its beam illuminating the base of the skin-textured wall. I looked at the entity as it slid closer, its sharp, black wires clicking against the mono-yellow wallpaper. Skirt and click, skirt, click. I felt a sudden, profound sense of clarity, a realization that washed over my mind like a bucket of ice water, freezing every emotion, every fear, every memory I had ever possessed. I paused. I looked down at my own body. I wasn't wearing my sneakers. I wasn't wearing my blue jeans or my faded green jacket. I was looking down at a flat, untextured, yellow surface. My arms weren't made of flesh and bone. They were two long, perfectly rectangular blocks of matte yellow matter that stretched out from my torso at a rigid, 90-degree angle. I reached up with my right arm to touch my face. My hand didn't have fingers. It was a solid, blocky stump. When it made contact with my head, I didn't feel skin or hair or a jawline. I felt a flat, vertical surface covered in a coarse, paper-like texture. I didn't have a mouth. I didn't have lungs. The sound of my ragged breathing wasn't coming from a human chest. It was an audio file being looped through an internal diagnostic circuit somewhere inside my core processing unit. The reality didn't dissolve, it recompiled. The infinite yellow corridors, the white ceiling tiles, the damp beige carpet. They weren't an alien dimension I had accidentally stumbled into from a cheap apartment building. They were the default environment, the baseline template of the universe. There had never been an Oak Ridge complex. There had never been a city, a snowstorm, a cash deposit, or a landlord named Mr. Vance. There had never been a friend named Sam who was bringing pizza to help me move. Those memories were just a temporary cache of mock data, a collection of synthetic assets loaded into my memory directory to give my autonomous routine a sense of purpose before the execution phase began. I wasn't a human being named Arthur who had gotten lost in the backrooms. I was an autonomous asset harvesting script, a digital construct generated by the system core to survey Sector 412 and collect the residual data remnants left behind by actual human users who had clipped out of reality years ago. My mind had invented the narrative of moving into a new apartment to rationalize why I was suddenly awake inside an endless landscape of yellow walls and humming lights. The human brain profile I was using was just a corrupted file I had scraped from the carpet fibers. The entity standing in front of me wasn't a monster trying to kill me. It was the cleanup protocol, the main system process coming to format my partition and integrate my collected data into the central grid. The brass room plate on its chest wasn't a trophy. It was my own serial number. The text messages from Sam, they were just the error logs, the system terminal trying to communicate that my neural simulation was desynchronizing from the hardware architecture. The entity reached me, its long, black wire limbs wrapped around my rectangular yellow torso with a tight, mechanical pressure. It didn't hurt. I couldn't feel pain. I could only feel the 60 Hz vibration increasing in intensity, rising from a dull roar to a blinding, absolute wave of pure frequency that filled every sector of my consciousness. The mono-yellow wallpaper began to lose its color, bleaching out into a flat, uniform, blinding white glare. The damp smell of the carpet dissolved into nothingness. The audio loop of my simulated human breath finally reached the end of its track and stopped. I looked at the white light as the system began to flush my local memory cache to the baseline. My thoughts slowed down, turning into simple, binary logic gates. True, false, unallocated, clear. A fresh line of system text printed across the center of my fading vision in clean, lowercase characters. Sector 412 render, complete all assets integrated. The light faded into an absolute, silent, hollow darkness, a perfect, zero-state void where there were no walls, no ceilings, and no sounds. Then a tiny, mechanical vibration started in the dark, a low, continuous, 60 Hz hum that caught in the back of my throat like a physical pressure. I opened my eyes. The moving boxes were stacked 3 high along the narrow concrete hallway of the Oak Ridge complex. It was a brutal, gray Tuesday afternoon in late November. My name is Arthur. I had spent the last 3 hours carrying my boxes up to the 4th floor. The rent was impossibly low, $500 a month. I turned the brass key in the lock of room 412 and pushed the door open. The floor was covered in a uniform, short pile carpet. The color was a sickening, faded shade of yellowish beige. Runtime sequence, restart 0314.